trauma affects every corner of life negatively. And so that's why we need to be willing to look at this stuff, and I hope you are. So there's two types, big T, little t. There's a spectrum, severe to mild. So the danger for most people is when they hear trauma, they only think of severe. And they go, oh, I've never had anything severe happen to me, so I don't have trauma. Most of trauma happens in the more mild end of the spectrum. And so that's why I'm going to encourage you to say, okay, I probably have it. I wonder where I fit in on the spectrum. So some of you may go, yeah, I know I've got severe trauma, sexual abuse, physical abuse. But other of you might go, I don't think I have severe trauma, but I'm open that I might be on the more mild end. And I think this is going to be an interesting ride for you if you're open to that. And you're going to learn a lot about yourself and a lot about getting healthy. So let me go back to this big T trauma just to add a couple things. So big T trauma, that horrific event. So you think of a car accident, war, rape, hurricane. So what happens in the body, in the brain, when there's this horrific event, extreme danger? The body emits two chemicals. Number one is cortisol, which then releases adrenaline. And that gives you energy to fight or flight. We got to get out of here or we got to fight this thing, because that's our only way of survival. Then it releases a second thing called oxytocin. And if you're a woman and had a baby, you probably have heard of oxytocin. Oxytocin is the love connection chemical. It's what makes you, after labor, and this child just tears you apart and causes you more pain than you've ever had in your life, instead of wanting to kill them, you want to hug them. That's oxytocin. You can thank God for that. Because now it just says, I love you. I want to connect with you. I don't care about how much pain you just caused me. I just want to connect. There's warm feelings with that. So what happens with this horrific event happening? Oxytocin. The baby then cries because it wants to connect. The child cries because it's calling for mom or dad. And it goes running looking for them. When the parent hears the child's cry, it releases oxytocin in their brain. And they want to run and hug the child and support the child and protect the child. So it's for a child who doesn't have natural strength, oxytocin is released to say, run to somebody with strength and help get them to support you. So let's say a child's in a home where the trauma is coming from dad, who's a violent drunk, and he is beating the kids. And so they have cortisol. They can't run, fight or flight, so cortisol's no good. They got oxytocin. They want to run for help, but nobody's helping them. Nobody's returning that. So that's not helping. So in that situation, the brain says, let's stop cortisol, let's stop oxytocin, that's not helping. And it goes to a third chemical as a last resort called opioids. And what do opioids do? Let's get ready for pain. I am going to release opioids into the body so you don't feel pain. So what happens with cortisol? When cortisol is released, it sends blood into all the muscles. It sends sugar, extra sugar into all the muscles, so you have extra strength to fight or flight. What happens when opioids are released? All the blood comes out of the extremities, around the heart, and basically it is saying we're getting ready to get cut so we don't bleed to death. So we're going to center the blood around the heart, and we're going to release pain-deadening medication, opiates, so that we don't feel pain. And so that's freeze. That's the extreme response when a child can't fight or flight. So think of that. Why do you think fentanyl is such a big thing for people from childhood trauma? Because their body's already been releasing opioids. And now when they find fentanyl, they go, oh, this just takes me to this wonderful pain-free place. So everybody's trying to solve pain and danger is what I want you to see. So big T trauma is in the realm of what we would consider the abnormal. Stuff that doesn't usually happen. That's why it's big T trauma. But the danger is to think that all trauma is abnormal. Only a small part of trauma is in the abnormal realm. So let me go back to this little t, because this is the one that we're going to talk so much about. It's less memorable, but hurtful, far more prevalent, misfortunes of childhood that do far more damage to the psyches of children. It has long-lasting negative ramifications that come from what seem like highly insignificant events. And so this is where people go, well, that shouldn't have bothered me. That wasn't such a big deal. Other people have it worse than me. Why am I even complaining about this? Because it's little t trauma, and it did have ramifications that are big. So here's an important thing to understand. Big T trauma, hurtful events. So in a home environment, big T trauma, abuse. Physical abuse, verbal abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, spiritual abuse, violence. It's big T trauma. Little t trauma is not about bad things happening. It's about good things not happening. It's about what should have happened not happening. About the unconditional love and acceptance and respect and somebody understanding them not happening. It's about neglect. It's about parents being in the room but not being emotionally available. Parents not present to the children. Parents not getting the children. So, little t trauma is what we're finding is the effect of big T trauma in the brain is very similar when you look at the brain of little t trauma. It changes the brain in the same ways. It affects the brain in the same ways. And you go, well, a bit of neglect. Surely that's not trauma. How can that do so much damage? It does a ton of damage. And that is so key to understand. So to take that a little bit further, what we come to understand is the ones most affected by little t trauma are the most sensitive. And so about 80% of people with little t trauma were very sensitive children. And that makes a lot of sense. So their brother might not have been so affected by dad getting angry and yelling and screaming every night, but this sensitive child, that was terrifying. And so the sensitive are very subject to the little t trauma and the effects. What is neglect? So if you remember, we talked about the 12 needs that every person has built into them. Physical needs, emotional needs, intellectual needs, relational needs, spiritual needs. If those needs aren't consistently met, then the child experiences neglect. Because they're not able to meet those needs themselves. They're not big enough. They don't have the tools. They're dependent on somebody else meeting all of those 12 needs for them. And if those needs aren't being met, then they're going to have little t trauma. So when you look at physical needs, intellectual needs, relational needs, spiritual needs, emotional needs, most parents and families today are good at physical needs and intellectual needs. Emotional needs, that's where the trauma usually happens. The failure to meet consistently the emotional needs of the child. And so you got two things then that are going to come out of that. So understand that little t trauma is a child has a need that can't be met, but they can't resolve it. So little t trauma is about the ongoing inability to resolve a problem that's hurtful. So they have a need, they try to resolve it, nobody's meeting it, they ask for help, they get criticized, they get punished, they get told they're weak, they get told to quit being a baby. They try, they adapt, they wear masks, they try to be a people pleaser, they try to be a perfectionist. Maybe then somebody will meet my need. Nobody does. So they try, and the need doesn't get met. Now what happens is they don't feel safe. And they have emotional pain. This hurts. I don't like having my need not met. Something in me is not happy about this. There's a discontent. There's a pain. All of that is happening subconsciously, but it's happening deep within the child. And so now they have another thing they can't resolve, pain. So they have a need that couldn't be resolved, which has resulted in pain that can't be resolved. So now they got pain on pain that can't be resolved. And so that then makes them go, must be my fault. I must not be good enough. So you see how their identity now starts to change. I must not be lovable. I must not have enough value. And so now they develop a negative self-identity that starts to come out of that. And so because of the 12 needs not being consistently met, because the parents were too busy, had their own issues, all kinds of different possible reasons, the child then lives with pain that they cannot resolve. So they then don't feel safe. Because if nobody's meeting my needs, I feel all alone. I feel nobody cares. And so now it's me against the big bad world because nobody seems to be helping here. And so I feel very scared. I feel very unsafe. And so now what you begin to see is the main emotion is starting to be their emotion, fear. Instead of love and joy, fear becomes the main controlling emotion. And so now I can't relax because I might get hurt. Now I got to walk on eggshells. I got to be on guard all the time because something bad might happen. So they have to develop a vigilance that becomes part of their survival. And so it becomes this ongoing problem they can't resolve, which leads to ongoing ways of coping. And so trauma occurs when a child doesn't feel seen, known, or connected.